The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. And it didn't just change everything. It ended a world. Sister Mary Catherine stood in the dusty telegraph office in Copper Ridge, Montana, staring at the 5 clipped sentences that had just erased 12 years of her life. Convent closing, stop, assignment, complete, stop, released from vows by dispensation, stop, God bless your new life, stop, 12 years, 12 years of bells and prayers, of stone walls and silent halls, 12 years of being someone. And now, she was no one. Just a woman named Catherine Brennan, standing in a town that smelled of mud and whiskey, with $3 in her pocket and a carpet bag full of clothes that no longer fit the person she was supposed to be. She was free. And she had never been more terrified in her entire life. She had to find work. It was a simple, brutal fact. Catherine pushed through the doors of the Copper Ridge General Store, the bell announcing her arrival with a jangle that sounded like a judgment. The woman behind the counter, Margaret Fletcher, looked up. Her eyes were kind, but they were also sharp. They missed nothing. "Help you, sister?" "Just Catherine now," she said, the name feeling like a borrowed coat. "I'm looking for work, any kind." Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows shot up. "Heard about St. Bridget's closing, a shame." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I might know of a place, but I'll be honest with you, it's not for the faint of heart." A flicker of hope, desperate and thin, sparked in Catherine's chest. "I'm not faint of heart." "It's the Dalton Ranch," the woman said, watching her closely. "James Dalton, he's been looking for a housekeeper. Been through 3 of them this past year alone." Catherine's hope wavered. Why did they leave? Mrs. Fletcher picked up a rag and began polishing the already spotless countertop. "Folks around here have stories. James has been a widower 2 years now, lost his wife Sarah in childbirth. They say the grief broke something in him, and his daughter, Emma. They say she's running wild, untamable." She stopped polishing and looked Catherine dead in the eye. "The last one left in the middle of the night, just packed her bags and walked the whole way back to town. Said the place was haunted." Haunted. After 12 years in a convent, the idea of ghosts seemed almost comforting. It was the living that scared her. "Haunted by what?" Catherine asked. "By whatever happened to his wife," Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice barely audible. "He's a good man, honest, hard-working, but he's wounded. And some men, when they're wounded, they're more dangerous than a cornered wolf." The warning hung in the air, thick and heavy. Catherine should have walked away. She should have taken her $3 and tried her luck in the next town over. But she thought of the emptiness in her pocket, the gnawing fear in her gut. What choice did she have? "I'd like to meet him," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Mrs. Fletcher gave her a long, searching look, as if trying to gauge her breaking point. Then she nodded slowly. "He's out back, loading supplies. But Catherine, be careful. That ranch holds more secrets than just grief." She found him by the wagon, a tall, broad-shouldered man heaving sacks of grain as if they were weightless. His face could have been handsome once, but now it was a mask of hard lines and shadows. He didn't seem wounded. He seemed carved from stone. He looked up as she approached, and his eyes, a startling, icy blue, narrowed with suspicion. "Mr. Dalton," she began, her throat suddenly dry. "Mrs. Fletcher sent me, about the housekeeping position." He dropped a 50-pound sack of flour onto the wagon bed with a thud that shook the planks. He wiped his hands on his trousers, his gaze sweeping over her simple gray dress, taking in every detail. He saw the former nun. He saw the desperation. "You can cook?" His voice was a low rasp, like gravel grinding together. "Yes, and clean, sew, tend a garden. I managed the convent's accounts for 8 years. "I've got a daughter," he said, cutting her off. "Emma. She's 10. She's difficult." The word was an understatement. Catherine could hear the exhaustion in his voice, the raw helplessness of a man at the end of his rope. I've worked with difficult children before. He studied her for a long, silent moment. She met his gaze without flinching, a trick she'd learned from facing down Mother Superior's disapproval. She needed him to see strength, not piety. The last one said the house was haunted, he said flatly, a challenge in his tone. I'm not afraid of ghosts, Mr. Dalton, only of starving. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his face. You'd live in the house, a room off the kitchen, board and $20 a month. He cleared his throat, a muscle working in his jaw. It's a business arrangement, nothing more. You'll have my respect and protection. That's my word. There was a finality in his voice, a promise as solid and unyielding as the man himself. When do I start? Today, he said without hesitation. We leave in an hour. There it was. No time to think, no time to second guess. She was stepping out of one world and into another, and the ground was already crumbling beneath her feet. I'll be ready, she said. The ride to the ranch was a journey into a different kind of silence. Not the peaceful quiet of the convent, but a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to emanate from the man beside her. The land itself was beautiful and brutal, a place of jagged peaks and endless sky where the wind never stopped blowing. Storm's coming, James said, his first words in almost an hour. He pointed toward a bank of dark clouds in the west. Montana weather, it can turn on you. I'm not afraid of storms, she replied. He glanced at her, and for a half second, she saw something other than grief in his eyes. Approval. Good, he grunted. Out here you can't be. The ranch appeared over a rise, a collection of sturdy log buildings hunkered down against the vast, empty landscape. It didn't look haunted. It looked lonely. As they pulled into the yard, a girl who could only be Emma burst from the barn. She was a whip-thin creature in boy's trousers, with her father's dark hair and an expression of pure, unadulterated hostility. She saw Catherine and froze, her small face hardening into a mask of suspicion. Emma, James said, his voice weary. This is Miss Brennan. She'll be keeping house. Don't need one, the girl snapped, her eyes as blue and cold as her father's fixed on Catherine. I do just fine on my own. It wasn't a child's defiance. It was a soldier's challenge. Catherine saw a girl standing guard protecting a fortress of pain. She stepped down from the wagon, her movements calm and deliberate. I'm sure you do, Catherine said, her voice even. Your father told me how strong you are, but maybe you're tired of doing it all. Maybe you'd rather be with your horses. She'd seen the way the girl's gaze kept flicking toward the corral. A flicker of interest crossed Emma's face before the mask slammed back into place. Maybe, she said, the word dripping with scorn. Then she turned on her heel and stalked back into the barn, vanishing into the shadows. James let out a long, slow breath. That went better than I expected. Usually she throws things. He looked at Catherine, a question in his eyes. You see it, don't you? The anger. I see a girl who's terrified of losing anyone else, Catherine said, meeting his gaze. I know what that feels like. A current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of a shared, desolate country. The land of the lost. Then James's face shuddered again. He grabbed her bag from the wagon. Let me show you the house, he said, his voice flat once more. The house was clean, but it felt hollow, as if the life had been scrubbed right out of it. There were no pictures on the walls, no books on the shelves, no sign of the woman who had once lived and died here. It wasn't a home, it was a holding place. Her room was a small monastic cell off the kitchen. It was more than she could have hoped for. That night, lying in the narrow bed, Catherine listened to the sounds of the house, the creak of floorboards as James paced in the room above, the frantic, muffled sound of Emma crying in her sleep. And something else, a faint, rhythmic scratching sound coming from the wall behind her bed, the wall that connected her room to the main parlor, a parlor that James kept locked. The scratching continued for hours. It sounded like fingernails on wood, like something was trying to get out. Or maybe, she thought with a sudden chilling certainty, it was trying to get in. The next few weeks fell into a tense, unspoken rhythm. Catherine cooked and cleaned, her movements silent and efficient. James worked the ranch with a relentless fury, as if trying to exhaust the demons that chased him. And Emma watched. She watched Catherine with a hawk's intensity, testing her, waiting for a crack in her calm facade. The girl never spoke a word directly to her. If she needed something, she would tell her father, who would then relay the message. It was a strange, triangulated existence, a household of ghosts orbiting a core of unspeakable pain. Catherine tried to ignore the strangeness, the way the ranch hands would stop talking and stare at the ground whenever she approached, the way James would sometimes stop in the middle of a task and stare at the distant mountains, his face a canvas of such profound loss it made her ache. And the locked room, it became an obsession. The parlor. Why was it locked? One afternoon, while James and Emma were out mending a fence line on the far side of the property, Catherine stood before the door. The scratching sound had stopped a week ago, but the silence that replaced it was somehow worse. She tried the handle, locked, as always. She ran her fingers along the frame, searching, and found it. A key tucked away on a high ledge, covered in a thick layer of dust. Her hands were trembling as she slid it into the lock. It turned with a rusty groan. The room was not a parlor. It was a nursery. Everything was covered in white sheets, like sleeping ghosts. A cradle in the corner, a rocking horse with a faded, painted smile. A small chest of drawers. It was a room frozen in time, waiting for a baby that had never come home. Sarah had died in childbirth, James had said. Lost them both. He'd whispered in his grief. Catherine lifted the sheet from the cradle. Inside, lying on a small, yellowed pillow, was a single, perfect white feather. An angel's feather, some would say. But as she reached for it, her fingers brushed against something hard and cold beneath the pillow. She pulled it out. It was a small silver locket. She clicked it open. On one side was a miniature portrait of a smiling Sarah Dalton, beautiful and vibrant. On the other side was not a picture of James. It was a tiny, exquisitely detailed painting of another man, a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile she didn't recognize. A floorboard creaked behind her. Catherine spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. James stood in the doorway, his face ashen, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, cold fury. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the locket in her hand. "Get out!" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "James, I didn't mean—" "I said get out!" he roared, taking a step into the room. He lunged forward and snatched the locket from her hand, his fingers bruising her wrist. He slammed it shut and shoved it into his pocket. "This room is private. You will not come in here again. Do you understand me?" The violence in his voice was shocking. This was the monster Mrs. Fletcher had warned her about. The wounded wolf. "Yes," she whispered, backing away. He followed her out, his presence filling the hallway, radiating a rage so palpable it was suffocating. He slammed the nursery door shut, the sound echoing through the silent house like a gunshot. He locked it and pocketed the key. Then he turned to her, his chest heaving, his jaw clenched. For a moment, she thought he might strike her. "Pack your things," he said, his voice deadly calm. "You're leaving, now." "Please," she begged, her mind reeling. "Let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," he bit out. "You're a spy, aren't you? They sent you. The Fletchers, the whole damn town. They sent you here to dig up my past, to find things you have no business knowing." "No," she insisted, tears welling in her eyes. "I was just curious. I heard a sound." "Liar," he spat. He pointed a trembling finger toward her room. "Get your bag. I'll take you back to town, and if you ever set foot on my land again, I will not be responsible for what happens." The threat was unmistakable, the kindness she had glimpsed in him, the shared grief. It was all gone, replaced by a cold, hard hatred that chilled her to the bone. She had stumbled across a secret he was willing to do anything to protect. The man in the locket, the locked room, the baby who never came home. It wasn't just a story of grief. It was something far darker, and she had just made herself a part of it. As she turned to go to her room, defeated, a small figure appeared at the end of the hall. Emma. She was holding a rusty pitchfork, her small knuckles white around the handle. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fierce, protective fire. She wasn't looking at Catherine. She was looking at her father. "Leave her alone," Emma said, her voice shaking but clear. She didn't do anything wrong. James stared at his daughter, his anger faltering in the face of her defiance. "Emma, this is not your concern. Go to your room." "No," the girl said, taking a step forward, the pitchfork held like a spear. "You always do this. You get angry and you break things. You break everything. But you're not going to break her." The raw pain in the child's voice was a physical blow. James staggered back as if she had struck him, the rage drained from his face, replaced by a look of utter devastation. He looked from his daughter's defiant face to Catherine's tear-streaked one. He looked at the locked door. He had just been caught, not by Catherine, but by his own daughter, who had just exposed the truth of their broken lives. He raked a hand through his hair, a ragged sob escaping his lips. He leaned against the wall, his broad shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words torn from him. He wasn't speaking to Catherine. He was speaking to the ghost in the locked room. Catherine stood frozen, caught between the broken man and the fierce child who stood guard over his secrets. She was supposed to leave. She was supposed to run. But she couldn't. Because in that moment, she realized the truth. The house wasn't haunted by the dead. It was haunted by the living. And Emma wasn't afraid of Catherine finding a secret. She was afraid of her father being consumed by it. The standoff ended as quickly as it began. James pushed himself off the wall, his face a mask of exhaustion. He looked at Catherine, the anger gone, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. "Don't go," he said, his voice rough. "Please, don't go." It wasn't a request. It was a plea from a drowning man. Catherine looked at Emma, who slowly lowered the pitchfork, her eyes still wary. A silent truce had been called. For now. That night, an uneasy peace settled over the house. No one spoke of what had happened. It was a new secret, laid on top of the old ones. But something had changed. The walls between them had cracked. Catherine saw James not as a monster, but as a prisoner. And Emma was his warden. The next morning, Catherine found Emma in the barn, currying her horse with a furious energy. "Thank you," Catherine said softly. Emma didn't look up. "He didn't mean it," she mumbled into the horse's flank. He forgets himself sometimes, when he thinks about her." "Your mother?" Emma nodded, her small shoulders tense. "And the baby, Thomas." "Thomas. The baby had a name." "It's okay to miss them, Emma." "I don't miss him," the girl said, her voice hardening. "I never knew him, and I barely remember her." She finally turned, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "But I remember what happened. I remember the screaming." A cold dread washed over Catherine. "What screaming?" "The night they died," Emma whispered, her eyes wide with a remembered terror. "It wasn't just Mama. There was a man. He was shouting. Papa was shouting. And then it was quiet. Papa came out and said Mama and the baby were gone to be with the angels." She took a shaky breath. But angels don't make men scream like that. A man. Another man was there the night Sarah died. The man from the locket. Who was he, Emma? Catherine asked, her voice barely a whisper. Emma shook her head frantically. I don't know. Papa told me I was dreaming. He told me never to talk about it again. He said it would be dangerous. Dangerous. The word echoed Mrs. Fletcher's warning. This was the secret James was guarding with his rage. Not just his grief. He was protecting his daughter from a memory of a man who made people scream. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke that afternoon. It wasn't just a storm, it was a deluge. Rain fell in solid sheets, and the wind howled like a banshee. James and the ranch hands were out in the maelstrom, trying to save a group of cattle that had been trapped by a flash flood in a low-lying pasture. Hours passed. The sky grew dark. Catherine and Emma waited, the tension in the house as thick as the storm outside. Emma sat by the window, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the rain-swept darkness. He always comes back, she said, her voice a tiny, hopeful thread in the roaring chaos. But as midnight approached and there was still no sign of them, even that thread began to fray. Catherine's prayers were frantic, desperate pleas. She wasn't just praying for a man's safety anymore. She was praying for the father of a little girl who had already lost too much. Finally, they heard it. The sound of a single horse stumbling into the yard. Catherine threw the door open. It was one of the ranch hands, Pete. He was soaked, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, and his face was a mask of sheer terror. It's the boss, he gasped, sliding from the saddle. James, the river. A log broke loose. It swept him away. The world tilted. Emma let out a small, strangled cry. Is he? Catherine couldn't bring herself to say the word. I don't know, Pete choked out. The current's too strong, we can't find him. He's gone, Miss Brennan. The river took him. No. It couldn't end like this. Not now. Without a second thought, Catherine grabbed a heavy oilskin coat from a peg by the door. She snatched a lantern. Emma, stay here. Bolt the door. Don't open it for anyone, she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. Where are you going? Emma cried, grabbing her arm. I'm going to find your father, Catherine said, her eyes meeting the girl's. She plunged into the storm. The wind and rain were a physical force, trying to beat her back. The lantern cast a weak, flickering circle of light in the maelstrom. She followed the riverbank, shouting his name until her throat was raw, her voice swallowed by the roar of the floodwaters. The river was a churning brown monster, filled with debris. It was hopeless. He was gone. But she couldn't give up. For Emma. For the man who was so much more than the monster he pretended to be. Then she saw it. A flash of color snagged on a fallen tree, half submerged in the raging current. A piece of his blue shirt. He was there. Trapped. She waded into the icy water, the current sucking at her legs, trying to pull her under. The water was up to her waist, then her chest. She fought her way to the tree, her hands screaming in protest as she grabbed onto the rough bark. He was pinned beneath a heavy branch, his face pale and still, his head lolling to one side. He was unconscious, or worse. She pulled at the branch with all her might, but it wouldn't budge. The river was rising, threatening to swallow them both. She was going to fail. They were both going to die here. God help me! She screamed into the wind. And as if in answer, a voice cut through the storm. Miss Brennan! It was Carlos, the other ranch hand, on the bank, a rope coiled in his hand. He threw it with a practiced flick of the wrist. It landed just within her reach. She grabbed it, her fingers numb with cold, and tied it around the branch. Together they pulled. The branch shifted, just enough. Catherine scrambled, getting her shoulders under James's chest, and heaved him free. He was a dead weight. She somehow managed to drag him through the churning water, back to the safety of the bank. He wasn't breathing. Panic seized her. But then, 12 years of convent training kicked in, tending the sick, the dying. She remembered the rhythms, the motions. She pushed on his chest, forcing the water from his lungs. Once, twice. "Breathe, James," she sobbed, her tears mingling with the rain on his face. "Breathe, you stubborn man. For Emma, breathe." He gave a great, shuddering gasp, his body convulsing. Water poured from his mouth, his eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. They found her face, looming over him in the lantern light. "Catherine," he rasped. "I'm here," she said, relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. "You're safe." He was alive. She had pulled him back from the dead. But as she helped him to his feet, leaning on Carlos for support, her lantern light fell on something half buried in the mud at the river's edge, uncovered by the flood. It was a saddlebag, old and rotted. But the buckle was distinctive, a silver star. It had been torn open by the flood, and its contents had spilled out into the mud. A faded piece of paper, and a small, tarnished silver locket. The same locket she had found in the nursery. Her blood ran cold. This saddlebag had been in the river for a long time. It had been buried here since the night Sarah died. James saw it at the same moment. His face went rigid. He stumbled forward and snatched the piece of paper from the mud, his eyes scanning the faded ink. The look on his face was not grief. It was pure, unadulterated terror. He knew what it was. He knew whose saddlebag this was. It belonged to the man who screamed, the man from the locket, and the river had just given up his ghost. They got him back to the house, his body shivering uncontrollably, his mind somewhere far away. Catherine and Emma worked together, stripping off his wet clothes, piling blankets on him, forcing hot coffee laced with whiskey down his throat. Emma was a tiny, fierce general, her fear replaced by a steely determination. After he was settled, asleep from exhaustion in front of the fire, Catherine took the locket from her pocket. She had picked it up from the mud, unable to leave it behind. She cleaned it carefully. The man's smiling face looked up at her. Who was he? She turned her attention to the paper James had shoved into his coat. He had dropped it by the fire. She picked it up, her hands trembling. It was a letter. The water had smeared the ink, but much of it was still legible. It was a love letter. To Sarah. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "I cannot live like this any longer, watching you from afar. Dalton does not deserve you. He is a brute and a coward. The child you carry is mine, not his, and I will not let him raise our son. I am coming for you tonight. Be ready to leave. We will go to California, and finally be the family we were meant to be. Yours forever, Thomas." Thomas, the baby's name, the man in the locket, the man who had screamed. The world spun on its axis. The baby wasn't James's son. Sarah had been having an affair. She was planning to leave him. This changed everything. The story James had built his prison around, the tragic loss of his wife and child, was a lie. A carefully constructed lie to hide a truth so much uglier, a truth that had ended in screaming. Catherine looked at the sleeping man by the fire. He was not a grieving widower. He was a man betrayed, a man whose wife had been about to run away with another man, taking a child that was not his. What had happened that night? Had Thomas arrived to take Sarah away? Had James found them? The shouting Emma remembered. Was it a confrontation? A fight? A cold, horrifying thought took root in her mind, a thought so dark she could barely form it. Had Sarah's death been an accident? Or had the rage Catherine saw in him, the rage he'd turned on her, been unleashed that night with deadly consequences? She had saved a man from the river, but had she saved a hero? Or had she just saved a murderer? The next day, James was weak but recovering. The storm had passed, leaving a world washed clean. But inside the house, the air was thick with unspoken truths. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He knew she had the letter. He knew she had the locket. He knew the lie was over. Catherine waited until Emma had gone out to the barn. She walked over to the fire and stood before him, the letter and the locket in her hand. "It's time you told me the truth, James," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's time you told me what really happened to Sarah, and to Thomas." He flinched at the name. He finally looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a pain so vast it was like looking into an abyss. "You think I killed them," he said, his voice a dead monotone. "I don't know what to think," she replied honestly. "Emma heard a man screaming, and now the river gives up his final letter, a letter that says he was coming to take his son." James closed his eyes, a shudder running through him. When he opened them again, they were filled with tears. "His name was Thomas Fletcher," he whispered. "Margaret Fletcher's nephew, a schoolteacher from back east. He came to stay with her for a summer." Margaret Fletcher, the kind shopkeeper who had sent her here. Had she known? Had she sent Catherine here to uncover the truth her own nephew had died for? "Sarah. She was lonely," James continued, his voice breaking. "I was building this ranch, working from sunup to sundown. I was here, but I wasn't. Thomas was. He was gentle. He talked to her. He saw her. I didn't. Not anymore." The confession was raw, brutal. "I didn't know about the baby, not until that night. He came here just as the letter says. He was going to take her away. I found them in the yard, their bags packed." He stared into the fire, his mind replaying the horror. "We fought. I was insane with rage, betrayed. I hit him. He fell and hit his head on the stone well. He didn't get back up." Catherine gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Sarah started screaming. James choked out. "She ran, not to him, from me. She ran toward the river, in the dark. I went after her, but she tripped. She fell, hard, the baby. The fall started the labor too soon. There was so much blood." He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with decade-old sobs. "I carried her back to the house. I tried to save her. But it was too late. She was gone. The baby was gone. And Thomas. I went back outside, and he was dead." The story was more terrible than she could have imagined. Not a murder, but a cascade of tragedy, one violent act leading to another and another. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I panicked," he said, his voice ragged. "I was a dead man. I had killed Thomas Fletcher. I would hang. Emma would be left an orphan, so I hid him. I took his body, his horse, his saddlebag, and I buried them in the riverbank, deep in the mud. I prayed a flood would never uncover them." He looked at her, his face a ruin of guilt and shame. "I told everyone Sarah died in childbirth. A tragic accident. No one ever knew Thomas was even here that night. No one but me, and Emma. She saw it. She saw me fighting with him. I told her it was a nightmare. I made her bury it. I made my own child carry the weight of my sin." This was his prison. Not grief, but guilt. A guilt so heavy it had crushed the life out of him, out of his daughter, out of this house. "And Margaret Fletcher?" Catherine asked. "She knew," James said. "Thomas disappeared. She knew he was sweet on Sarah. She suspected, but she had no proof. She's been watching me for 2 years, sending housekeepers out here, one after the other, hoping one of them would find something, hoping one of them would uncover the truth." It all clicked into place. Mrs. Fletcher's warnings, the stories about the ranch, the way the whole town seemed to be holding its breath. They were all waiting for the ghost of Thomas Fletcher to rise from his muddy grave. And he finally had. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Are you going to the sheriff?" She looked at this broken man, this father who had made a terrible mistake and had been paying for it every single day since. She thought of Emma, finally free from the nightmare her father had forced upon her. She thought of the law, a black-and-white institution in a world of gray. He deserved punishment. But had he not been living in a prison of his own making for 2 years? And what would happen to Emma if he was taken away? What happened that night was a tragedy, Catherine said slowly, choosing her words with care. A terrible, tragic accident. Thomas died. And in her grief and terror, your wife ran and fell and lost her life and the life of her child. James stared at her, uncomprehending. You did not murder your wife, Catherine stated, her voice clear and strong. You protected your daughter. You made a choice in a moment of panic, a choice to hide one tragedy to prevent another. It was the wrong choice, but it was a choice made from a father's fear, not a killer's heart. She walked over to the fire. She held Thomas's letter over the flames. It curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The river washed away the past, she said, her eyes meeting his. Now you have a choice, James. You can stay buried with it, or you can crawl out into the light and be the father Emma deserves. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw the man he could be, the man he was before the guilt consumed him. Hope, fragile and tentative, flickered in his eyes. Why? He whispered. Why would you do this for me? I'm not doing it for you, she said softly. I'm doing it for Emma, and I'm doing it because I know something about being given a second chance. The secret was out, not to the world, but to the people who mattered. The house, finally, could breathe. The change was immediate. James started talking to Emma, really talking. He told her the truth about what she had seen that night, apologizing for making her carry his burden. He asked for her forgiveness, and the little girl, who had been a soldier for so long, finally laid down her arms and cried in her father's embrace. The locked nursery was opened. Together, the three of them packed away the tiny clothes and the cradle. They didn't bury the memories, they put them to rest with love and truth. James took the silver locket to Margaret Fletcher. He walked into her store, laid it on the counter, and told her everything. The woman wept for the nephew she had lost, but she did not call for the sheriff. She saw the change in James, the lifting of a burden that had been poisoning him and the entire town. She saw that justice had finally, in its own way, been served. The peace they had found was hard-won and precious. The ranch began to feel like a home. Laughter, a sound that had been absent for years, started to echo in the halls. Catherine taught Emma how to cook, and Emma, in turn, taught Catherine how to ride. James watched them, a quiet wonder on his face. He started smiling again, the deep lines of grief around his eyes softening. He and Catherine would talk for hours, late into the night, sharing the stories of the lives they had lived before they found each other. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, he turned to her. I thought my life was over, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You walked into the middle of my storm, and you didn't run. You walked right into the heart of it, and you pulled us all out. He took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. Marry me, Catherine. Be my wife. Be Emma's mother, for real this time. She looked at this man, reborn from the ashes of his past. She looked at the house, now filled with light. She thought of the girl who was now her daughter in all but name. She had come to this place seeking work, a sanctuary from her own fears. And instead, she had found a family. She had found a purpose. She had found love in the last place she ever expected. Yes, she whispered, tears of joy tracing paths down her cheeks. Yes, I'll marry you. The wedding was a small affair, held right there on the ranch with Margaret Fletcher and the ranch hands as witnesses. Emma stood beside Catherine, her face beaming. As James kissed his new bride, the setting sun bathed them all in a golden light, a promise of a future as bright and vast as the Montana sky. She had spent 12 years praying for God's grace behind stone walls, but she had found it here, in the heart of a broken man, in the fierce love of a little girl, and in the surprising, redemptive power of the truth. Her life had not ended when the convent doors closed. It had just begun. If you were moved by Catherine and James's story of redemption, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. There are always more secrets buried in the past, just waiting for the right person to bring them into the light.